said, my background is in Gestalt therapy. One of the main things I learned from Fritz Perls was he talked about the process of change. And he said, you know, very often people make programs that it should be like this. We're going to make change and it should be a certain way. And he pointed out that the idea of deliberate change never works. You ever notice that? You know, like, you know, I'm going to change this way, and somehow it never happens, okay? Because what happens is when you focus on making a certain change happen a certain way, then a counterforce in us and our clients ends up coming in and kind of neutralizing that movement, that, you know, so the person really doesn't move. So basically an opposing force is created that prevents change from happening. Okay? And what he mentioned was, what was interesting is that if you can accept what is, simply accept it where it's at, then instead of fighting the symptom, instead of trying to make something different happen, the person is able to grow and move through that situation. But the point was that he was talking about acceptance. Okay, so you really want to accept it, and that's kind of like, you know, like I would watch the Carl Rogers videos, you know, when I was first learning psychology. And I'll be honest with you, I was watching the video and going, you know, he's like, you know, really accepting and, you know, like, you know, and just like, you know, active listening. And I'm going, what are you doing? You know, you're not doing nothing. You know, like, you're not telling the client to do this. You're not telling the client to, you're just sitting there and listening. You're just accepting them. You know, what's that about? Okay? And you'll see that it's actually very powerful to just accept someone and be a witness to their process. Okay? And we're going to talk about why that would be. So Perls pointed out that when you take responsibility and you own what your behavior is, then growth and integration begins. And basically that's the paradox of change, that the more you can accept the person exactly where they're at, then the more the person is able to move forward. Okay. I'm not a researcher, I'm not into research, but I realized that in doing this presentation I needed to have a little background and talk about research a bit. Basically, what's the best psychotherapy? How does paradoxical methods compare to behavioral cognitive and psychodynamic? How important is the Therapeutic Alliance? How does resistance impact the therapy outcome? And does treating secondary non-criminal behavior impact targeted, in this case, problem sexual behavior? All right, so what does the research show? Basically, the unbiased research shows that cognitive behavioral and psychodynamic therapy have equal success rates. Okay, and to tell you the truth, that's kind of surprising because they seem to be doing a lot, you know, very different things. How you'd think that one of them would kind of rise to the top, and it would be that way. Oh yeah, that's the one that's working. Okay, but at least unbiased statistics, and you have to say unbiased because if you're a CBT guy or person or gal, then their research shows that this is what's really doing it. Okay, and at least the unbiased research doesn't really support that. Okay, so we're actually going to talk a little bit about that as we move along. Why would that be? Okay, in terms of paradoxical interventions. It turns out that behavioral, cognitive, and psychodynamic work for the client that is motivated. If you have a client that's motivated and they want to change, they realize they have a problem, okay, and they really want to change, then behavioral, cognitive, psychodynamic techniques will be effective with that client. Paradoxical interventions have been shown to have a higher success rate with the treatment-resistant client. Okay. The strength of the alliance, so in terms of the Therapeutic Alliance, what the research does show is that whether you're doing cognitive, behavioral, psychodynamic, okay, that whatever the Therapeutic Alliance is actually the most important aspect of the treatment. Okay, and if you think about what is the Therapeutic Alliance, it has a lot to do with attaching to that client, right? So we're going to use, as you know, in the field, we've kind of come to the realization that attachment is very important. Early attachment is very important in terms of working with, in terms of that client's development. And if you think about what the Therapeutic Alliance is, the Therapeutic Alliance is that sense of attachment between you and that client. Okay? And again, the research shows that the better you can have that alliance with your client, the more likely that client will move forward. Okay? In terms of resistance, well, as you might expect, the research shows that the more resistant that client is, then the prognosis of that person changing is also a problem. So what's interesting about a paradoxical intervention is I don't really deal with resistance, okay? Because I just bypass it. Like the client may want to resist. I'm not saying that they don't want to resist. They do. But I kind of it's kind of like an Aikido type intervention where you kind of use that client's resistance as a way to kind of move them forward. All right? So I kind of join the resistance. Okay, and as I mentioned before, it turns out that when you work on anger, in terms of secondary non-criminogenic behaviors, if you can help that client change their anger, social skills, manipulative behavior, that will help that client change the criminogenic aspects of their behavior. Okay, Freud's Legacy. Okay, the good, the bad, and the ugly. In my view, at least, paradoxical interventions and paradox psychology. By the way, I have a website, paradoxpsychology.com. Okay, that's me. All right, check it out if you think that this is an interesting presentation. But we take the science of what Freud did and kind of move that forward. And as you'll see, that's one of the good aspects of Freud. So obviously, Freud had a very big impact on the field. And part of that was that he wanted to present a comprehensive system to understand conscious and unconscious motivations. He attempted to create a scientific approach in terms of human behavior. And he did suggest that there was a potential for cathartic release of blocked energy that can result in rapid and long-term change. Okay, how many people work with cathartic change in their practice, right? Again, that's one of those things that, wow, that would be really great, like spontaneous change, right? That's really cool, right? But how would you explain that? That's kind of hard to explain, right? Well, I'm going to try to explain that today, is that there's actually a way of conceptualizing what spontaneous change might look like. Okay? In terms of Freud's work, as you know, it is very controversial. The main problem was that he took objective science. He took stuff that people could observe, okay, and he mixed it with very subjective ideas. In other words, ideas that he had that he thought were good ideas that really nobody could prove or disprove. He kind of mixed them together and came up with his theory. Okay, objective ideas were such things as you can look at animals and see that they have instinctual drives. When a person has a repetitive behavior, you can kind of see that there's a repetition occurring. But he also incorporated his own personal subjective views, such as id, ego, and superego. That's a very nice idea. But again, you really can't prove that exists or doesn't exist. It's kind of conceptually nice, but you can't really show the reality of that. And the same with the Oedipal complex. Okay. The ugly part is that he didn't define certain things. So certain things were important to deal with and talk about, but he didn't quite address them. So he never quite defined the concept of change. He never really addressed free will, okay? Because as people, one of the things that makes us different than animals is that we have free will, okay? So one of the things that I look at, actually, in terms of even treatment, is that if you think about it, animals have instinctual behavior. All right? What's instinctual behavior? Instinctual behavior is a rigid behavior that the animal must do. The animal doesn't have a choice. Okay, so if you put an animal in a certain situation, instinctually it will react in a certain way. What makes us different as people is that we have free will. We don't have to react to our instincts. Now, it turns out that if you have a client and they're reacting impulsively and from their instinctual side, their animal side, what that means is that they have animal self-esteem. All right, what's animal self-esteem is basically low self-esteem. All right, that they're acting out as an animal. But if a person uses their free will and doesn't react on an impulse, okay, of their own free will, what's going to happen to their self-esteem? It's going to go up, okay? So one of the things that I want to do in a paradoxical intervention is to get that person to incorporate their own free will in making a change in their life, okay? And when that occurs in the person, when they make that choice, what's going to happen is the reward of free will is actually self-esteem. So although I don't officially give a client a reward, I'm not going to say, hey, that was a great job, wonderfully changed, that was great. I don't really say that to clients. But what happens is that when they use their own free will to make a change, that's when their self-esteem actually goes up. And that's one of the things that will actually reinforce that their new behavior is going to stay on because they changed of their own volition. Okay, so the observable concepts were instinctual drives, repetition, compulsion. In a later version of this, I also include cathartic change, because if a person makes a major change, you can actually see that. But also, again, there were unprovable, unobservable concepts, such as id-ego, superego, Oedipal, and even dream interpretation. That was like Freud's interpretation of dreams, but that's his interpretation. It may not be another person's interpretation. So in terms of the observable concepts, we have instinctual drives, impulses, repetition, compulsion. And Freud talked about understanding children in terms of their instinctual drives. Okay, but again, as I pointed out before, he left out the fact that people actually have free will. Okay, so that was only half the story. And one of the things that we will talk about is sublimating. I mean, it turns out, by the way, if you're going to live in society, if you're going to only react on impulse, okay, you know, as you put an animal in a cage, all right, if a person is going to act out of impulse, then we have to put him behind bars, okay, in a cage, in a prison, okay, and or in, you know, in a behind a locked door in a psychiatric facility. So my point is that if you're going to live in society of your own free will, you have to be able to control your impulses so that you're not reacting in a negative way. Okay, so repetition, compulsion. It turns out, by the way, that repetition behavior, he called it repetition compulsion, is the main focus of psychology. Okay? But basically, the DSM is a book, a thick book, of predictable and repetitious behaviors that you can kind of diagnose a person if they do those behaviors. Okay? So in his day, he may have called it repetition compulsion. In our day, we kind of have separated them out a bit, so that basically if a person has a personality disorder, they have a certain rigid kind of behavior that's repetitious. OCD is obviously repetitious. Even borderlines have repetition behavior. Addictions, repetitive cycles. Very often, as you'll see, one of the nice things about repetitious behavior is that it's predictable. Okay, and I'm going to use that in my therapy to help that client recognize that what they think is spontaneous behavior is actually very predictable. Okay. And you're going to see the way that I frame it in my mind is that it's really an orbit. An orbit, you know, when you look into, in terms of astronomy, if you look at the movement of the planets, you'll see that they're in an orbit, a predictable orbit of behavior.